folks, it's Chris with the Human Project. In this podcast, what we're going to talk about is something called the Pareto Principle, something you might have heard of as the 80-20 rule. We're going to spend some time exploring that, talk about how I came to understand this principle and apply it, and give you some tips, some actions that you can take with putting this into place, all while exploring motivations for why we do things, and what are some challenges that we have of doing this, and what's the cost of not doing it. So hope you'll join us on this podcast, listen for what we talk about, and let us know what you think. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Chris.
How's it going?
It is really good. How about you?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm excited to talk about all the things we're talking about today.
Yeah, this topic was something you mentioned recently, which I'd heard before, but I'm really curious why it came up for you. It's something, a fancy term called the Pareto Principle.
Ah, the Pareto Principle. Yeah, this is one of my favorite mindset tools that I like to use personally in my work and when I'm coaching and working with leaders and organizations. It is, a lot of people have heard of it as the 80-20 rule.
Yeah, that's a lot more common terminology for it.
Yeah, but it's the Pareto Principle is the fancy term for it. And it's essentially saying that 20% of our effort produces 80% of our results.
Okay.
And vice versa, 80% of our effort is on the other 20% of our results, which most of the time we tend to think of our effort and our output having one-on-one correlation.
Sure.
And it often doesn't work that way. Like we'll be working with teams a lot of times and we'll hear the phrase, oh, we're 95% done. And you're like, oh, okay. That 5% is not going to take the 5% that you think it is. It's going to take so much longer because it drags on. Or my favorite other example of this is thinking about like a toothpaste tube, tube of toothpaste.
Yeah.
And you start squeezing it when you first get it, it's brand new. And it goes all the way up to like, you have like an inch left in it. And that takes you like a week to get there. And then that 1 inch of toothpaste seems to last you like another month. Right.
And you got to work really hard at it too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But I'm like, I'm going to squeeze every last drop out of this. But there's this tendency, I think, that we have to try and optimize and get to 100% with everything. Okay. And that's really difficult. That's really hard. And we spend a lot of our time wasted on something where we could be focused on something else. Yeah. Not trying to optimize for the least valuable thing. To be honest, it's always kind of in the back of my mind. Yeah. I am a starter at a lot of things. Okay. And I am not good at finishing things. Okay. So I think it comes naturally to me, which we're having worked together for several years. You know this about me, I think. And you're very different. Yeah. So we'll get into that in a little bit because I want to hear the challenges.
I'm braced for impact.
80-20 rule with you. But for me, it's really natural to get started on something. I have all this momentum and I'll keep going. And then over time, gradually the effort starts to increase and the output that I have starts to decrease. Okay. And I ask myself all the time, what's good enough?
Wow.
And my definition for good enough is pretty low for a lot of things. Yeah. Our friend Derek knows this about me as well.
Yeah. Good enough. That's a phrase that I've had to learn. Definitely. How did you come to that spot? Like what circumstances brought you to the place where you are a good starter and then you are asking that question, what's good enough?
Yeah, I think I first got introduced to the Pareto Principle when I was working in an organization responsible for product development. And one of the things we were working on, we didn't have enough time to get done everything that was on the list.
Which is, let's be honest, everywhere we've ever been.
Sure. Right? Yeah. There's a reason the word prioritization exists.
Right.
Because you wouldn't have to do prioritization if you could just get everything done. Right. There would be nothing that falls off the list. Yeah. So I had a really hard time with that because up to that point, you're not going to believe this, but up to that point, I had been the kind of person that got everything done that was asked of me all the time.
I don't believe it.
I know. It's weird. I've changed significantly since then. And because a lot of it was expectations other people had on me and that I had on myself. Like I didn't want to disappoint people. And so I'm sure that's a tough part when we dive into the specifics more.
Yeah.
But what I realized was I wouldn't be able to get everything done. So I had to focus on what's the most valuable thing and what can fall off the list or what doesn't need to be accomplished 100% of the way. And so it became really valuable for me to help really increase the value that our team provided and our organization had of being able to focus on the most valuable things and consequently not focus on the least valuable things. Did it make some people upset? Absolutely. Did stuff not get done that people wanted? Absolutely. And that was hard. That was really hard because, like I said, a lot of my success was meeting people's expectations, right? And so 80-20 rule, Pareto principle really helped free up that mindset. And I've never looked back since.
It sounds like you were almost like shoved into a corner. I mean, your job was to maximize the value of what your team was doing there.
Yeah.
And you realize you can't keep operating the way that you couldn't keep operating the way that you were and be able to do that effectively because there was no way it was all going to get done. It wasn't just your effort involved, but if you did nothing about it, you were actually not going to do your job well. Right.
Sorry.
I was just going to observe, I think many people in that circumstance would either run away from it, pretend it didn't exist. I don't know. There's a number of options there. Get depressed, get angry. There's a number of things. And so I think it's really tremendous. I don't know the journey in that specific moment, but that's a tremendous outcome for you to have shifted your stance on something that you held on to so strongly. And as we get further in that, I'd be really curious about some of those things that helped you make that shift. Because I think, for all of us perfectionists, I might be one, that are looking to try and rebalance in this regard. I think some of those things that you discovered in there would be very rich for us.
Sure. Yeah. And I make it sound a lot easier than it actually was.
I'm sure it was me.
It was.
You don't just drop something like that,
Right.
At the drop of a hat.
That's not a hack.
That hurt. Yeah, it's not a hack.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think, it was over a period of several years to actually get the full effect of that. When we work with teams, one of the principles we talk about a lot of Agile, which is a tool we use of mindset, whatever. Won't get into all the specifics and nuances of it here. But one of the principles that they talk about is simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. And as I read through that the first time, I was astounded. Like, what do you mean that maximizing the amount of work not done? But as I learned more and more, there's data, lots and lots of data and analytics out there that shows that stuff, particularly in the software development space that we work in, that stuff that we build often doesn't get used or doesn't accomplish the value that we thought it would. And so that was really freeing for me of like, okay, well, how do I know and how do I differentiate what's that stuff versus what's actually going to be valuable?
Yeah.
And so it took time for me to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since I've applied it to my personal life as well. But I'm curious because we've talked about this several times, this 80-20 rule, Pareto principle. What challenges do you have when it comes to applying that?
I think you described it well in your where you came from before that rule you were talking about. Because I remember reading that manifesto statement as well, the Agile statement of maximizing the amount of work not done. It was literally a divide by zero for me. It did not make sense. Does not compute. Maximize the work that's not done. And then shortly after that, I got to the point where I'm like, that makes sense. And I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
Like I get it. Why would I want to waste doing things that are not helpful and useful? But to what you just said exactly, like, how do I know what those things are? And I think that's depending on how you look at it, that's one of the biggest challenges. That's also one of the biggest enjoyments in this situation too, is that it's discovering what is that, and there's no straight answer to that either. It's a discovery process. But for me, as what I call myself a recovering perfectionist, you described it well. Expectations of others, in worst interpretation I could give, as a slave to those things for years, and well trained in that, I guess I would say. So that's hard to set down. That's not just something that I just go, okay, I'm just going to stop doing that. Easy peasy. And the other thing is there is something so satisfying about getting something to full completion, like absolutely every, T has been crossed, I has been done kind of situation where you're like, complete. That is so satisfying. And so to say, just get part of it done or do just enough, I'm not sure what that looks like. It's like asking me to take part of a step and just stay there. That's kind of how my brain reacts to it. Go like, what are you, how would you, how do I, I'm just like, it still doesn't compute fully. Even so, I guess I'm in the spot where I go, I mentally assent. I agree. I'm not going to argue with the science and the studies, and execution still baffles me on how to walk that out. But again, I would go back to something we talk about regularly too, is the motivation for it. So what's motivating me?
What's my motivation?
Let's come up with that little jingle for motivation that we can sing it at the same time we talk about it every time. But like, what's driving me? What's my engine at that point to say, I want to get it completed? And we've talked about two of those motivations already that are worth just making super clear. I want to please other people, and I want to get the satisfaction of being done. And those, neither of those are in and of themselves horrible.
Sure.
And neither of them in and of themselves are meant to be God.
Right.
Neither of them are meant to rule the day. Shifting from those so that they're, if you will, in context, they're put in the right framing, I think is part of the challenge of getting to 80-20. Chris just gave the look of, what?
No.
Oh, dear.
No, I just helped connect some other dots of things that we've talked about in the past.
Yeah.
Of motivation, what's underlying. I really appreciate you bringing that up, because one of the things we've talked about a lot that we both think through a lot is, what is my responsibility versus dependency on God, right? And looking at that as a continuum, and they're not two sides. It's all tangled and together, and a wonderful mess that is anything that has to do with how God has created us.
It's not a simple answer to that question.
Yeah.
Is God, it's just all going to be God. On the one hand, you could say that God will do what God's going to do, right? He's going to accomplish his purposes. And on the other hand, he's inviting me into his work. And so I'm not meant to be passive about it. And so that rich territory in between that you're describing right there is a difficult one, because there's not a simple answer to that. What's my responsibility in this? And that, putting it back into the Pareto principle, like, where is the 20%, so to speak, that God is inviting me to activate on right now, is a really rich and challenging question. There's nothing simple about that.
Yeah, I think it's the right now piece of what you just said is the most critical.
Okay.
Because there's always going to be an infinite number of things that we could potentially do, whether that's in our work, whether that's in our job, whether that's the relationships that we maintain and that we put energy and time and effort into. Whatever that is, there's going to be stuff that is there that can wait, and stuff that is most important for us to take action on right now. And so asking that question, what is most important for me to take action on right now? It's a great way to get to that 20%. Yeah. And being okay with the motivation of, if something changes, not just falling in love with the plan that we originally set for ourselves and the commitment that we made for ourselves.
You went there.
I think, to me, my plans are always really flexible. I figure out what's, at this moment, the most important thing for me to work on next. And it has its challenges, because I'll commit to something and not make clear that that's my normal way of operating. And I'm sure that it does seem like I'm dropping the ball to people, because I have said, I've gotten good enough with this thing, now I'm moving on to the next thing. And so it's challenging, and it has a cost. It definitely has a relationship or a relational cost that's associated with it.
Part of what's coming to mind when you're talking about that is that it's one thing to do 80-20 myself. Right. As soon as we bring one or more other people into this situation, my 20% and what it looks like to me of good enough, and the connection with other people who in some way, are impacted by or are working on this together with me. That's just like amped up the complexity, the challenge of the situation of collectively what's our 20% that we're doing.
Yeah, it's something that you can't just determine by yourself too. Right? It's not. I probably made it sound harsher than it actually comes across for me. Of just like, okay, cool, I'm done. See you guys later. There's a
you
lot.
Losers are working on 80%.
I hope there's a lot more nuance than that. But yeah, it's definitely and people have different priorities too.
Yeah,
that's another challenge that comes into play. And so it's figuring out what is core for me, my responsibility, and ownership, and obedience, and all of the other things that we're talking about here.
So if I take it to some principles, what's coming to mind for me is to say, ask a question shockingly. I would go back to asking a question when we're starting, like, what do we think good enough is? Kind of start to sketch that out. To me, when I think about that, that helps me get out of the assumption. Because if we don't talk about that, I'm going to assume it's going to be 100% perfect without meaning to. Right? So what do we think good enough looks like here? And then build the habit of returning to that, because we're going to learn as we're going along and discover, like, actually good enough is right here. We've discovered that we don't need to do this, or we've discovered that this is good enough, or that there isn't going to be good enough, or we discover that it's over there and we're going to move it. Like, let's get into that, the habit of repeating that
I think
for ourselves.
I think that's a really good way of looking at it, of making clear up front. So starting to shift all this into action, because we've been talking all over the place here with Pareto principle, but I think that's a great direction to take it, is when we talk about, when we're starting off on something, make clear, like, hey, let's try implementing this, and let's talk about what is good enough, or how do we know we're being successful with something. And so at that moment in time, when you say, okay, let's evaluate this, you can say, is this worth us continuing to put effort into, or are we willing to drop it and move on to something else? Just that clarity, I think, regardless of what it is, whether it's a group project, whether it's you're working on a product with a team. I think those are a good way to bring that to bear, right?
And of course, another tactic is to put a time box on it.
There you go. Let's do this for X number of weeks and evaluate and see what.
Or even we're going to put in, let's just invest 10 hours over the course of a month or whatever it might be. Sure. And then come back and evaluate what it is. That might be good.
Experimentation, which we will talk about at some point, I'm sure, in this podcast.
Now, as I've tried to walk into this more, when it's gone well for me, the mindset you're describing there, I find it very free. Really. It can be, put it that way. When I have a healthy mindset about this, it is really freeing. It's almost like I can ride in the car, or I can ride the roller coaster and enjoy the ride and be part of it in a way that's healthy. And do I know where it's going? No, I don't. Do I know when it's going to end? Not exactly. And it ends up being a fun, like, journey of discovery, if I put it in floofy kind of sounding terms. But it does actually end up feeling like that. There is an enjoyment in the freeing sense of that. The only part that I just want to bring up at this, that's still a challenge for me, is when I'm saying no, not that, not now kind of thing, like for the not 20% that we think that's not something important right now. My brain is still trained to say, don't lose that. Hang on to that. We might need that later. To get to 100%, or maybe just, we discover we need it later, or whatever the case might be. And I find that a lot of times I'll set my brain processes off to try and just keep remembering that. Don't forget that we might need to do this. Don't forget that we might need to do this. And after about 5 of those in a day, I am stressed because I'm trying to essentially juggle all of this. Don't forget we might need to do this stuff. And it's no longer has that feeling of freedom and joy that I was describing a minute ago.
I think in the team context, that's really easy for people to do, is, hey, we talked about this was mentioned, so it ends up on an ever-growing list of things that we're never actually going to do, because something's always going to come in. Translate.
Like every idea, every possibility has merit. Yes and no.
And so there's a tracking cost, is what you're talking about.
Yes.
There, of how do you balance that? I don't know the best answer for that in the personal setting.
Yeah.
In a work setting, I like to say if it's something you haven't talked about or touched in 3 months or 6 months or however the complexity is, just let it go.
Yeah.
Because if somebody's not actively asking for it or you don't have data that it's worth doing, let it go. What that looks like and how that translates personally.
I can tell you how that looks for me personally. 2 things. First of all, I tend to try and trick my brain into saying I've written it down. So I'll just type it in like an electronic document somewhere, and there you go. Right? If I want to find it again later, that's interesting. Depends on where I store it, if I can actually find it. But that means my brain is not trying to juggle it. But I remember when one of our friends we used to work with, he said, like you're talking about, but with his email box, he said, if I haven't addressed an email in my inbox in a week, I delete it.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, I got stressed instantly thinking about that.
Shoulders started to go up.
Because like my inbox is deep, man. It's deep because I might respond to that email from a year ago that I didn't or whatever, But that to me is like my test almost that I would challenge everybody to consider is what if you just deleted everything? I mean, it doesn't have to be a week, but what if you deleted everything that you hadn't replied to that's been in your inbox for a month? Like, are you really going to address that thing?
How urgent is it?
Are you really going to deal with this? It seems very unlikely.
So to land the plane here.
Yeah.
80-20 rule, Pareto principle, talking about how do we maximize our effort towards the things that produce the most output. And consequently reduce our effort on the things that don't. And so when we're talking about the sense of overwhelm that I think we hear people talking about a lot, or busy, that we hear a lot, this is one of the best ways that this mindset can help us start to put these things into practice.
If we look at it through the lens of the Bible as well, I think it's worth pointing out that listening to God about what he's saying is important and how he's wanting us to participate with him in this is really a key to it when you get down to it. Because the faithfulness of God is what enables us to start to let go of some of the things that we think we need to do and pleasing others.
Answering the question, God, what do you want me to do right now?
Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Good conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I love it.
Thanks again for tuning in to today's episode of the Human Project Podcast. Our team is made up of myself, Chris Conlin, Mark Wavle, and our lead editor, Derek Donley. We're a crowd-funded nonprofit. Most of what we do is free because of your generous support. If you want to learn more, check us out at humanproject.us. Thanks for partnering with us. Looking forward to talking in the next episode.